Welcome to the Black Science Podcraft. This is a cross between a podcast and a presentation where you'll have one speaker delivering a concept, a theory, an idea to the other. So the goal is to allow you to critically analyse these points and to see if they hold any weight. So why black science? So there's a few reasons behind the term black science. Stay tuned to find out.
After the treaty signed in 1738, there was two very distinct Maroon tribes. They're important because it's a little known fact that there were different tribes that made up what we now know as Maroon. So we're from two separate sides of the islands, and we'd use the abeng and the talking drums to speak with each other. I mean, when you have successive slave revolts or slave escaping, the language would have been diluted each time you've got successive wave of freed slaves coming in. Yeah. I'm not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. And I think that's the ethos of Maroonage. Greetings, one and all. Welcome to the second presentation. I'm Chief Naba Sage, and this presentation is entitled ASAFO, The Journey of a Warrior. So I'm going to speak briefly in this first section about Maroon history. Many of you that watch conscious programming will be aware of most of the history, so I'm going to give a whistle-stop tour, I guess, of the history, if you like, so we can get right into kind of my journey as it relates to kind of my process in becoming a chief, both in Ghana and the Nyankopon tribal nation. Okay? Yeah. So what's in the name? The title Maroon, I think it's important to first state this, is that we didn't initially call ourselves Maroons. So the name etymology it's got a number of meanings, one of which is maroon is a colour, a tone of brownish red. And I think when we were speaking in our your presentation, Match Fit, around the use of the term black and how accurate it is, all of the chiefs, not all of the chiefs, shout out to L.A. Lewis, speak specifically around maroon being a more accurate identifier of our actual tone, the brown and reds. Now, I don't necessarily agree or disagree, but it's just in terms of the term used. So maroon is a brown reddish tone. Now, I wouldn't argue in the same way that you did for black that we need to use that term extensively, because it's a self-identifier. So it's not a term that I'm kind of placing as we should all use it. It's just in terms of the etymology, there is a colour code to it. That maroon is actually a colour, as well as kind of the history of maroonage. So another term for the maroon, another definition of the term maroon is a runaway or fugitive. And that was a term that the British would have used for us when they first encountered us in 1655. However, the Spanish, who had colonised the island from the early 1500s, they've got a term which is probably more likely to be the origins of the term as Simulon, which also means fugitive, runaway. Simulon.
Cimarron, which means runaway slaves who hide in forests.
Cimarron.
So what were you saying earlier? The colour thing. Who's saying the brownish red is more what we are?
So some of the chiefs who don't like the term black, and I think it's usually around separating maroon heritage from the wider black diaspora. And in the same way that you spoke about the people having, I guess, ways to self-identify away from kind of the generalized terms. So I don't fully 100% agree with it, to be fair. I will still use the terms black, even though
it's like when they say they're copper-coloured people, isn't it?
So I mean, it all depends on what we're comfortable with. So the term was used by the British and by the Spanish, and the term took on relevance for us as we fought for our freedom in the New World. So we did at some point adopt the terms, but actually for a longer part of our origin story, we were a Khan, we were a ASAFO, we were Chromanti, we were Congolese. And I think what I will say at this point is that in a Kompong, we've got three very distinct burial sites. A Cromanti burial site. In modern terms, people will more know Cromanti as a Maroon language. And it's an admixture, a creolization of a number of different African dialects, Twi, Ga, and also kind of the surrounding.
The Maroons of Moortown in Portland are descendants of runaway enslaved Africans on the plantations of Jamaica. I, as a linguist, became interested in the community on reading a 1981 article by Kenneth Bilby entitled How the Older Heads Talk. The article suggested that in addition to regular Jamaican Creole, there were two other languages in use in the community. One language was Cromanti, clearly related to the Akan language cluster spoken in modern-day Ghana. This language was used by the Maroons to communicate with their African-born ancestors. The other language was Maroon Spirit language, as Bilby called it, or as the people called it, old-time patois. That language they used to communicate with their Jamaican-born ancestors. My question was this for real?
Yeah, everything to Ugoni.
Yeah, you know, Sataka, everything.
Chamu ye too.
That term was often translated to us as taxa, leave some, which means that some things are better left unspoken.
Anyway, they like to see Wagwan. So when you know come up here, we don't miss nobody.
So initially, and I wasn't going to go too much into kind of the authored history. I was going to speak more to the oral tradition. So Maroons would have been, well, actually, let me not say that. The Jamaican Maroons, if you like, are widely known. But actually, there are stronger communities in the New World. So Suriname, for example, has a huge Maroon population. I think the consensus in 2012 had them.
So when you're saying Suriname, because my understanding of Maroons was just Jamaicans.
No, there's the Maroon communities all over the New World. Africa, there's a strong one in North Carolina. There is Brazilian population, over 800,000 people in Brazil self-identify as Maroons. The reason why I mentioned the Suriname Maroons is that sovereignty after independence in Jamaica. So we signed a treaty in 1738 that people will know of, and 1739
in Jamaica.
In Jamaica,
this is the beginning of the Maroon.
Well, this is no. It's not the beginning. It's not the beginning because actually, there was actually a man named Juan de Bolas, who was a Spanish freedom fighter who was first enslaved by the Spanish. Now he developed some of the first Maroon communities in St. Thomas, but they weren't known. They weren't known as Maroons at that point. The term only became, I guess, a widely used term when we see the Akan and the ASAFO companies come in numbers to defend the Maroon communities. So Queen Nanani, the term. We use Nani now, but the term Na and Ni was the terms that would have been used in the community. So Na is the Ga term for king, and Na is the Twi term, the Ga term for queen, and Ni is the Ga term for king. So initially, she would have been called Na Ni, and that kind of speaks to her leadership.
To some people, this shadowy character, Nani, popularly known as Nanny of the Maroons, was an Obeah woman with supernatural powers, which allowed her to stop bullets using her buttocks. There are also stories of how, after only a few days of planting them, her pumpkin seeds sprouted miraculously to feed her starving people. However, there is enough evidence of her contributions to the Maroon resistance in Jamaican history. What cannot be disputed about her is that she led a guerrilla warfare between 1724 and 1739 to defeat the British. Under her leadership, Maroon communities in Jamaica united and negotiated successfully with the British for land. This led to a treaty which was signed in 1739.
Matriarchy is extremely important in Maroon communities. We've got Nanani, and I'm going to speak a bit later around some of the strong female freedom fighters that we find across the New World.
Sorry, so Nani basically means she's like the queen king.
Queen king.
She's the
Masculine.
queen king.
When we spoke last time, you was talking about the masculine and feminine energy.
Yeah, I mean, the way she would have inhabited or encompassed that term, she was a priestess of the Mayal tradition. So the Mayal is considered the first religion in Jamaica. So the Tainos would actually have practiced a form of Mayal, and the Arawaks would have also practiced a form of this. Now, when we came from West Africa, some of our practices, our ASAFO practices, our Ghani, our Kung Fu practices would have been syncretized into the population. So it is usually people think of Maroons as just an African presence, but actually the Tainos that were reportedly completely devastated. I think in 1509, the British consensus said there were 74 Tainos on the island. 74. And at this point, I think there's only 1,500 people on the island. But obviously, they hadn't charted the whole of the island. So, and I'll probably keep coming back to this throughout the presentation, where some of the records we have are from the British alone. So we have oral tradition, which is notoriously difficult to confirm with research. So some of the things I'll speak about are coming from the British records, and then comparatively looking at how our oral traditions either match up with, because actually Lord Trelawney, who was the general in St. James and Trelawney at the time, he would have used the term Maroon. He would have also used, we probably wouldn't have used. I've gone into to Maroons, the term Maroons already. What I think is important to mention at this point is that after the treaty signed in 1738, there was two very distinct Maroon tribes: the Leeward, which I'm a part of, which is Flagstaff, which is the old Kodjo town, and Akompong. Now, the history of that specifically, that Flagstaff had around 4,000 inhabitants in the early 18th century. When the second Maroon Wars started around 1760, around the flogging of a Maroon by some slaves, we set the old town on fire.
The slaves?
Yeah, so we was on a plantation raid, and we was caught by slaves. And the slaves flogged us.
The Maroons were good at handling weapons, and they were brave in their endeavors. Even if they were retreating, they did so skillfully. The story begins in 1795, when two Maroons were accused of stealing 2 pigs. Both Maroons were found guilty and flogged. However, it should be noted that the Maroons were flogged by a slave. For the Maroons, this was an unimaginable event that should never have taken place. So the Maroons decided that they would articulate their anger by speaking with the authorities. 6 leaders came to voice their concerns to the authorities, and these 6 leaders, they were taken as prisoners. And if you all know a little about the Maroons, this did not go well. The person who ordered that the men be arrested seemed to have had no idea about the first Maroon War and how the war ended.
That was the trigger point of the second Maroon Wars.
The second Maroon War, from 1795 to 1796. During the Second War, the Trelawney Maroons go on a bloody campaign of killing, destroying, and burning of plantations, resulting in the death of many people and much livestock. The destruction of a large number of farms instantly evaporates large investments made by colonists.
After that point, 4,000 Maroons were deported from Trelawney to Nova Scotia in Canada.
Yeah, I didn't know where that was for a second.
Yeah, so this is part of the reason why Trelawney Town, Kodjo Town or Flagstaff is one of the smaller communities now. because there's been successive deportations, and primarily because Captain Kojo was the leader of the Trelawney Maroons. Now, he'd initially signed the treaty, and there is some controversy around that treaty because there are, in the laws of pacification, now, for oral traditions purposes, we usually call this a surrender treaty because the British surrendered. But actually, when you kind of do, I guess, a more academic look at the treaty, we're not fully sure if Captain Kojo at that point could read English. And that's been some of the excuses that have been levelled in terms of why, in the laws of pacification, we find that Captain Kojo and his descendants are supposed to capture runaways.
The Maroons end up in two major wars with the British. The First Maroon War occurs over 15 years, between 1725 and 1740. It includes a significant damaging revolt. The conflict ends with the British agreeing to a treaty granting the Maroons autonomy and 1,500 acres of land. However, it comes at a price. The Maroons, in exchange, are expected to capture and return runaway slaves.
What you say? You think they didn't know that? You think?
No, I mean,
they didn't know the agreement said that.
I think. I mean, it's difficult to know. To be fair,
you think?
I like to think that he didn't know, but actually, I think.
But were they doing that after
the
agreement
not
was
until
signed?
1760, so 21 years after this, after the treaty was signed, the Taki Rebellion started, and there were some Leeward Maroons that were enlisted to fight with the British against the Taki Rebellion. So when I say about being a student of history, it's important not to kind of cherry pick the good parts of the history, and for me it's important to kind of take ownership of the full gamut of our history. And it's only really in the last 30-40 years that Maroon chiefs have been comfortable enough to admit to this. I mean, it's always been known because it's in black and white, but how that part of the treaty was enacted has been questionable. So oral tradition states that when we found out that there were some of us in the Leeward communities that were fighting against our best sovereign interest, we caught some of them and beheaded them. Now, the British will say that some of the records show from Lord Trelawney that he was sending correspondence back to the British Crown saying we've got some of the Maroons that are fighting with us. Now, there is a history of this, though. So when the British invaded the island in 1655, there would have been some Maroons that sided with the British to get the Spanish out. Yeah. And at that point, once they was out, the war began with the British. So
Citizen Boot Camp is a program we've created for 8 kids, secondary school kids preferably. And basically we teach strength and conditioning, we teach boxing, fundamentals, meditation, which includes breath work and mindfulness, and nutrition. We just teach them some things that we had to learn in later life, and it would be nice if someone had told us a bit earlier. Now, it's a community funded program, raise money to run this and pay for this. We give them a whole bunch of kit. They all get some gloves, they all get wraps, they all get a medicine ball, exercise mat, skipping rope, and they all get a resistance band. They even get some more stuff from sponsors that have supported this boot. And it's all done in Brixton Street Gym, the original sponsor. Yeah, if anybody's interested, please get in contact, pypbootcamp@gmail.com if you want to try and get involved in the next one, because we're going to keep running this, try and keep it a consistent program.
Loyalty throughout Maroon history, you can find dotted throughout the history people who have fought against our best interests. Now, for me, I would argue that you can free a slave physically, but you can't always free a slave mentally. So I would say that there was still people, I mean, living a rural life is hard. And if you've experienced, what's it called? What's the syndrome called when you fall in love with your captor? Stockholm syndrome. So I would argue that there would have been a percentage of us that would have experienced that would have longed for the comfortability, the security, even under torturous, barbaric conditions. They may have favoured that if given a chance. So there are small portions throughout history, to be fair, because I mentioned the Taki's rebellion. That's not the only time that we find that Maroons have fought against blacks.
Taki's rebellion was a rebellion of enslaved Akan people known as Coromantee and other Akan tribes that started in April 1760 and ended in July 1760 in the modern-day Jamaica, led by King Taki. On the 8th of April, Taki and his followers attacked the plantation where he worked, killing the owners and freeing all enslaved persons. Former slaves joined in the revolt and word soon spread to other plantations. By dawn, they had fought their way through estates, killing several European settlers and estate owners. Upon hearing the news, the Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica commanded the Maroons to fight Taki and his men and kill any Opia leader. This revolt could not be quelled for many months, but sadly the rebels were tracked down and killed by some Maroons. Taki was reportedly shot dead and his head was cut and displayed in the center of town to indicate that the rebellion had stopped and freed slaves were in fact in danger. Many enslaved people committed suicide to avoid being recaptured and sold off to different masters. Finally, the British reinforced order and conducted a mass unmarked burial for all enslaved people killed during the revolt. In all, about 400 enslaved persons were executed, about 600 were sent to be enslaved workers in the Bay of Honduras for their part in the revolt, and this resulted in the British passing a bill that imposed a prohibition on the number of enslaved Coromantee people entering Jamaica.
When the Maroons in Trelawney Town were deported to Nova Scotia, they linked up with what would have been a black loyalist community. So people that had fought in America, the American Wars, blacks that fought in the American Wars were given a portion of land.
You mean Confederate Wars? What was Confederate Wars?
Yeah, so then, and this would have been in the early 1800s.
Right.
Now.
So remember, originally I was asking, how did we get these Maroon communities everywhere? So,
well, this is the thing.
So there was the Jamaican, then there was the Nova Scotian, and these were the only two Maroon communities in the world.
No, there are Maroon communities in North America. But I mentioned North Carolina.
At that time, though. So
where did all these communities come from? Any time you find in the mid 18th century, right up to the beginning of the 19th, what you find is successive slave rebellions, and then once those slaves find communities, they're called Maroon communities.
From very early, when they were introduced into the New World, enslaved Africans started escaping from their Spanish captors. Some either joined indigenous people, while others or set up communities of their own in the woods or forests. Some chose mountainous areas to set up their settlements. Now, the communities which they formed were called Maroon because they were kind of secluded, from outsiders. The communities which the escaped people formed were so well established that even Francis Drake enlisted several Maroons during his raids on the Spanish, when the British and the Spanish were struggling over territories in the New World. So Maroons were known for their bravery. Most of them were warriors. Now, the communities that the Maroons created had to contend with great difficulties just to survive. And the white colonists did not make life any easier for them. And they often tried to starve them into extinction by cutting off their food supplies where possible. Against all odds, a number of these Maroon communities survived through farming, crops, and hunting. Some even managed to grow their population by assimilating more black people who escaped from plantations. They were very protective of their autonomy and would even go and raid plantations and harass planters, thereby instilling great fear in the planters, who dreaded a massive revolt of the enslaved people. There were Maroon communities in places like Haiti, whose leaders spearheaded the 6-year rebellion against the white plantation owners that preceded the Haitian Revolution. There were other Maroon communities in Cuba and Puerto Rico and in many other places such as St. Vincent, Dominica, Guyana, Panama, Suriname, and Colombia. There were others also in Mexico and from the Amazon River Basin to the southern United States, primarily around the Florida and the Carolinas. Unfortunately, most of the early Maroon communities were vanquished, and by 1700, most of them had disappeared from the smaller islands.
Right, so a Maroon community, by definition, is just any revolting community, any community that's fighting freedom.
Any slave result that ends up in a community,
independent
outside.
community. Now we classify as removed.
It's classified.
That doesn't mean that they are in organized somehow relationship to the other ones.
Well,
they might not even know about other ones, but they are Maroons.
Well, to be fair, the Leeward and the Windward. So, the Windward tribe and the Leeward and the Windward are used as terms to describe whether your community is going against the wind or going towards the wind. Okay. So the Windward Maroons in Moortown, Nannytown, Scots Hall, and Charlestown would have been known as Windward Maroons. They was facing the wind, and we in the cockpit country would have been a Kompong and Trelawney Town were known as Leeward Maroons. Now, the reason why there became distinct differences is because in the Leeward territories, there was the cockpit country is the most inhospitable land. So it would have been a place where you would have found the last vestiges of the Arawak and Taínos. So there was a closer admixture of people on the Leeward side than the Windward. The Windwards were able to kind of maintain a stronger, and this is why I mentioned the Cromanti burial ground, the ASAFO burial ground. It was clear that even though we was one unified fighting force on the sides of the islands, we still had different practices. So from internally, we would have had different burial practices, different funerary practices, potentially, and this can't be proved because we've got oral tradition, different spiritual practices.
The Comanche, again, that's the amalgamation. Is it? That's the one that's all of...
Yeah. And then we've got a Congo burial ground in Akombong as well. So, and I think it's important because it's a little known fact that there were different tribes that made up what we now know as Maroon. So, as an ASAFO, a warrior, so I don't think you even explain the term ASAFO. Asa is the Twi term for war, and Fo is the term for people. So, loosely translated in English, it means warrior people. And the education system that was instituted for communities, for survival purposes initially, was as a warrior and a priest. These were the two approaches we use to fight colonialism and embed a spirit of resistance and rebellion in our children.
So these are so that term has always been part of the Maroon.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at Moortown, that we've got a building called the ASAFO Yard. It's spelled like this. So ASAFO is spelled ASAFO, and ASAFO Yard is spelled ASAFU. ASAFU. So it's the same term. You'll find the Sankofa bird, you'll find a number of Andinka symbols painted outside that building. And it was the area that we used to plan our military strategies or try to unify, because what you said is right. We're from two separate sides of the islands, and we'd use the abeng and the talking drums to speak with each other. I mean, the Cromanti language has been lost now. My great-grand spoke it. But I think that generation, we've not done a good job in our generation of maintaining the language, to be fair. And I think maybe moving forward in terms of our education, I think it's something that needs to be brought back in terms of at least as a piece of academic research, to have it charted, because we've got in most Maroon communities, you've got people maybe over the age of 70 that still understand and speak it briefly, but under that no one speaks it. So it's a dying language, if you like.
And that's a mixture of all the different tongues.
All Western Central tongues.
But it was
primarily Congolese, Ghanaian, Nigerian, and Benin.
Yeah. Okay. And this was spoke up until when would you say that? Because I've never heard of it. Outside of you telling me about it, I had never heard of it.
It would have been used in Maroon communities quite...
So this was the language of Maroon communities in Jamaica?
Yeah.
Chromanti.
Yeah, Chromanti. But obviously when you have successive slave revolts or slave escaping, the language would have been diluted each time you've got successive wave of freed slaves coming in.
Yeah.
So that's why the language hasn't been upheld in maybe the way that we would want in terms of heritage. So I mean, one of the things I wanted to start with actually is a quote from Kwame Nkrumah that states, "I'm not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me." And I think that's the ethos of Maroonage that I know. So I wanted to, I've spoken briefly about the alternative history, and I wanted to kind of also go into...
So just remember, I was asking, how did we get all these communities everywhere? You kind of answered that, right? But they're not linked.
No, the ones in Jamaica were linked, and I think...
And the rest of them, they don't really know about each other. Suriname don't know about the Jamaican one.
They wouldn't have known until... So we have...
so they won't speak the same language. Obviously, there's no actual cultural link. It's just
I mean, this is why I mentioned the Suriname Maroons, because they had the Dutch that was colonizing them, and once they'd kicked the Dutch out, they'd maintained they all still have Twi names up until now. There was a expo in Ghana on Friday, just gone. And there was a delegation of 15 Suriname Maroons came to Ghana for cultural exchange for their independence. And what's clear is that they've kept the Anansi stories. So I grew up on Anansi stories, Anansi the Spider.
I love Anansi.
And obviously over time, I mean, I tell my daughter Anansi stories. Sometimes I make them up.
Yeah.
Like to meet her needs at whatever time. But what we find in the Anansi stories now in Suriname, they haven't changed too much from the Ghanaian ones, whereas the Jamaican ones have changed, where we've kind of had a lot more admixture of people groups, which means the stories that we tell each other change over the centuries. But you're right, the Chromanti isn't spoken, and there isn't a kind of a unified language for all Maroons. I mean, similarly, that different Maroon communities have different ID cards. And this is something that I would want to push for in terms of we shouldn't have different ID cards as Maroons. Maroons in Jamaica should have the same ID sovereign cards as Maroons in the rest of the Caribbean and across the diaspora, in my opinion. But obviously each community runs autonomously. I mean, Akompong and Flagstaff, the former Kodjo town, have worked quite well in collaboration, because when Maroons was deported, the ones that weren't deported made their way to Akompong. So there are close ties in that sense. But apart from that, for a long period of time, there wouldn't have been huge amounts of contact unless there's a war effort.
So the practices that you were saying that are done in Jamaica and Africa, is it the same as what's gone like over into Brazil, the other place?
I mean, Brazil's interesting because, again, the Maroons in Brazil don't all have just West African backgrounds. They come from all parts of West Africa as opposed to just Ghana. Whereas what you'll find in the Americas, like North America and the Caribbean, there's a strong presence of Ghanaians. Okay. People from, Akan Empire, which would have been Benin, Nigeria, Ghana, and bits of Mali at that time. So you've got closer cultural links in the Caribbean than you do with kind of the
I thought there was more like Nigerian. I thought it was a lot of Nigerian type. So you're saying it was more Ghanaian?
Yeah, the I guess the culture some of the cultural practices you'll find more prevalent in Ghana. And you know, there are a lot of Nigeria. Don't get me wrong. I mean, if majority of people in Jamaica do the DNA, it'll be Nigerian Ghana that we're gonna find. But generally, because of the culture that came across, and that might not be because of numbers. That might just be because
just most
Nanani, the governance systems in most Maroon communities was ASAFO, was Ghanaian. So that wherever you came from in Africa, and if you got to a Maroon community in Jamaica, you'd been under an Akan, ASAFO governance.
It's like Jamaicans in general, innit? It's small population but big influence.
Right. So
check out the Ndinkra Symbols Connect the Dots Drawing Book series. We have 4 books in the series, all with 33 Ndinkra symbols turned into Connect the Dots puzzles. You have the name of the symbol, the phonetic spelling of the symbol, the meaning of the symbol, and the proverb attached to the symbol, because they usually have one. You can catch them all on Amazon. Enjoy, fun for the kids.
That's why I ain't down, I'm anti. My heart beat, my bloodlines are shanty. I come punk, straight mama nanny. Charlie, how could never put my brother in chains? I ain't come to play no man games. Modern day Maroon, and that is plain. Anything test, no tree here gets slain. Uncle Future's here right now and I'm staying. I know overseer ain't changing my name. Now everything new they find, they claim it's shocking, it's a mystery. They're only digging up my hidden black history. Not all of us took transatlantic trips. We were sailing way before the sounds of the whip. The first men, the first sailors.
That's why I like to promote the use when we discuss Maroons, not just to kind of speak about Ghana, because it's not just Ghana that we come from. My mum done African DNA testing many years ago now, and at least 47% of our DNA, my matrilineal DNA, goes back to Mali. And at that time, though, Burkina Faso, that part of Burkina Faso would have been part of the Volta region in Ghana. So as we've changed, as borders have changed, Burkina Faso is a small country between Mali and Ghana. But at times of the Akan Empire, there would have been one empire with varying different tribes. And I think what we find when we see the ASAFO or the Ghanaian kingship and governance rituals and ceremonies, that's what led Maroon communities in Jamaica. And it's not the same in... there are a few... where's the other one? There are strong Maroon communities in Caribbean. The reason why I mentioned the Sarameka and the Okanasi is because the vice president of Suriname is a Maroon. So what we find in nowhere else in the world do we have Maroons acting in a political way. So that's why I think it's important to mention them, because for me, in terms of modern day rebellion and resistance, they have not only kept the culture and the spiritual systems, but they work from a place of resistance and rebellion as it relates to how they engage with the rest of the world, which I think is important. And that they might be quite well known among Maroon communities, but I don't think that Suriname Maroons are well known enough. The Sarameka, Okanasi, the Juka.
I never heard.
There are many tribes in Suriname that self-identify as Maroons, and they are a mainstay in the mainstream culture of Suriname in a way that Maroon culture, I mean, obviously Queen Nanny is a national hero. I think the only female national hero in Jamaica.
So I heard that the other day.
And out of all the ones that you've mentioned, when you say Suriname, I can't even know if I'm saying it right, but that's the one that I feel drawn to more, to find out and to learn more about for some reason.
No, I mean, to be fair, when I found out that the Suriname were taking a delegation to Ghana, like if I had the resources, I would have made my way over there. Because I'm going to go into the modern day Maroons. And I think it's important to mention matriarchy. So I'm going to read this briefly. I'll show the screen. Viewers will be able to see this on the screen. Right. Matriarchy and the family lineage and the divine feminine. So, on the continent, female title holders being placed in the highest levels of political and spiritual order were and remain a common feature of ancient and later post-colonial African political systems. In a Khan culture, the power with the divine sits with the mother. So what you'll see on the screen is an image of my mum. This was in Charlestown in 2022 when I was coronated as Chief of Culture, Heritage and Development. I wasn't able to be there, but that's my mum going into the bush with the bay leaves. And then what you'll see as well is what we believe, again, oral tradition, is one of the few photos I've got of my oldest ancestor. This picture would have been taken in the early 1800s, and we only know her as great-grandmama G. We don't know her full name, but we know she left Jamaica in the early 1800s to fight for Maroons in Panama. So there's been a book written, African Maroons of Panama, and I mean, there's a rich history in Panama, to be honest, and I'm endeavouring to do more research now.
So she went to Panama?
Yeah.
In the early 1800s?
Early 1800s, because the picture I think would have been taken when she left, and I think photography started in like the early 1800s anyway, so it would have been right at the beginning of the use of photography at that point. I think I've spoken about Queen Nana Nee. In terms of modern day Maroons, we've got Auntie Gloria, Mama G, and she's the first Gamang to be coronated by the Suriname Maroons, the Okanasi Maroons, in 2012. And that was actually the first, 2012 was the first time. Gamang is a leader or king. Lead is probably the best way to kind of, because it doesn't, even though it doesn't denote a masculine title, Auntie Gloria is the first woman to be coronated as a Gamang. So she was given, I guess, guardianship over the whole of the island, whole of Jamaica in 2012. So she currently lives in Moortown. She's the head of the Indigenous Women's Group. And to be honest, there was a film called Reimagining Queen Nanny made, I think, in 2013. It would have been a year after she was coronated, and she played Queen Nanny in a short film. And I think that's what kind of shot her to prominence specifically. But the reason why I mentioned her, and I'm going to go on to mention a few more, is that I don't think women are celebrated enough within our culture. And I think in terms of leadership as well, I don't think women are celebrated and promoted enough. So we've got Auntie Gloria, Mama G, and we've got also Kim Marcia Douglas. She actually passed last month, but she was the first female acting colonel for at least 100 years. So even though I speak about matriarchy being important, and there have been some really prominent Maroon women over the years, very few have wanted to take up political leadership.
She was a colonel.
Colonel Kim Douglas. I actually want to read this actually because she passed.
Woman be a colonel?
Yeah, she passed.
In what? In what? The Jamaican army?
No, colonel of the community.
What's colonel?
So like it's the first time
military title.
This is what
I don't understand.
So usually we use the word chief,
right?
And because of her, it's not a militaristic fight, but she. Very powerful personality, very militant character. So even though I think Colonel Pink in Scott's Hall was also a colonel, because of his personality, his character.
I don't understand. A colonel in what's the as opposed to being a chief?
It's a title. So she was given chieftaincy. So she was a chief of Charlestown,
right?
Like the recognised coronated chief, but her title was colonel. So she chose that.
So it's just a name.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not like a.
She didn't sit at the head of.
It's not like a rank. Do you know what I mean? Because that's what I'm thinking when you say colonel. I'm thinking of a rank.
She didn't sit at the head of a military group.
Right. Yeah.
In that sense.
This is what I'm saying.
But Charlestown and Moortown are very close, and Moortown historically was the place where we'd used ASAFO Yard sits in Moortown. So it's a place in which most of our military tactics were led from. So she's actually a descendant of a military part of the community.
And in that community, using that type of term makes a lot of sense. Okay. Right.
So I need to read this because she passed, and I need to read this. As a leader and spokesperson for one of the several Maroon communities in Jamaica, Acting Colonel Douglas stood as the first woman to occupy any such position of authority among Maroons in present day. As Indigenous women are reclaiming their rights as important decision makers and contribution to community development, Acting Colonel Douglas carried a vision of prosperity through social and economic gains for her community. The Colonel's expertise included, but what was not limited to, Indigenous knowledge, climate change, sustainable development, community tourism, and the rights and protection and the care of Indigenous peoples. So most chiefs will sit on councils globally. And when I speak a little bit later on around some of my experiences, it was that being put into a council that put me in contact with some of the Ghanaian chiefs, the Sierra Leone chiefs, and the global chieftaincy. So at the moment, there has been an effort over maybe the last decade to unify and bring together the disparate Maroon communities globally under kind of a Pan-African governance.
So that's happening. Like there's like a board of Maroon type thing happening. So all Maroon communities worldwide will come under like one stateship.
I don't want to say all, but most Maroon communities will be a part. Will have a representative on the councils.
Life is about movement. Life is moving forward. Yeah, you need a rest, but you only rest so you can recover, so you can move forward. I think the trick is to get comfortable with perpetual motion. I think the trick is to get more than comfortable. You have to enjoy the constant dance that is life. Keep moving. Don't go fast. Just keep going.
Hi everyone, my name's Jacob. Come and explore our fun and engaging early learning children's book, now available on Amazon or on the Jacob and Friends Early Learning website.
I want to speak about two specific Maroon chiefs now. So we've got Chief Richard Curry, who is the head of Akompong at the moment. And he was the youngest chief at 43 about 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah, he was the youngest coronated chief. And he sits at the head of around 1,500 acres. So in 1738, the Crown gave or surrendered 1,500 acres of the most inhospitable land in Jamaica called the Cockpit Country, and Chief Richard Curry sits at the head of that.
Is that the land at the moment that's being fought for? There's
been a huge amount.
Yeah.
So we had the lumber issues in Quickstep in Trelawney, and we've had consistent zoning issues around the sovereignty. I mean, Andrew Holness has said that there's no sovereign land, there's no sovereign peoples in Jamaica. And I said earlier that...
Who's that? So this is Maroon land by that agreement that was had before. And this, who you just mentioned
Andrew
now,
Holness,
is saying it's...
the prime...
that's the Prime Minister.
Yeah, to be fair.
So the Jamaican Prime Minister is saying that that land isn't the Maroon land.
There's no sovereign land.
But there's an agreement that says there is Maroon land.
There's no sovereign land, but it's UNESCO have attributed that land as preserved land. So what we had earlier in this year when...
So what about the agreement? Was there an agreement that established that as Maroon land?
Yeah,
that's what I heard.
In 1738,
in that agreement,
1,500 acres
that's yours.
Maroons. Now what happened in Jamaica in 1962 is when we got independence, that sovereignty became shaky because it was the Crown that gave Maroons that land. And as soon as Jamaica got independence, there's no longer...
That agreement doesn't mean anything because you...
So at the moment, Jamaica Maroons are... primarily Richard Curry, because he's doing some really good work in terms of trying to kind of raise the profile of some of the issues, because every year they'll kind of encroach on the land slightly. And that's kind of the reason why.
That's sticky. What do you think is going to happen with that? So basically, independence has happened. So the agreement that was had before isn't with the Jamaican government.
I would say.
So the Jamaican government doesn't have to uphold it. Is that basically the case?
I mean, obviously Jamaica is still has the Privy Council. We've had Vibe Cartel get released the other day because of the Privy Council. So Jamaica still pays tribute to the British Crown. But the reason why I mention it is that because I would argue that in 1962, when Jamaica gained independence, Maroon leaders at that point should have done more to make the case for what happens to our lands. And I don't think enough was done.
No one did anything.
I mean, enough wasn't done publicly to secure that sovereignty in legal senses. Because we don't have a standing army. We don't have a standing army. We can't we can.
But surely this stuff is, if there's a document, because like you just said, Privy Council, that means they're still linked to the UK legal system. The document exists. So is it in court? What's happening?
Chief Richard Curry has done a number of claims, put a number of claims in. But what happened a couple of years ago, and this is political now, is that historically, chiefs have taken money from UNESCO, UN for development. And the money hasn't always got to the community. So what we've found is that there have been poor leadership at points where monies hasn't been spent properly. I mean, my Chief Grizzle in Trelawney was deposed in February this year for mismanagement of funds. And historically, we find if you don't have in place real democratic processes, it leaves people for crooked leadership. I mean, we see it across the African continent now in terms of leaders kind of misappropriating funds. You say, okay, how come the chief ours looks like that and the roads are still bumpy when there was money given for roads? So these are the things that Chief Curry has been trying to fight against. And the reason why I mention it is that he did have some issues with some of the other chiefs when he came into power, because he was speaking so strongly against the government, when actually there was other chiefs at that point still taking bits of money to do bits and pieces, and there wasn't a unified front. I think maybe during COVID there might have been a meeting where they kind of invited him, but for at least 2 or 3 years Chief Richard Curry was kind of locked out in terms of the other chiefs kind of accepting that actually if we're going to make any inroads in terms of the sovereignty in this land, we all need to band together and fight the system legally from one unified front. And that hasn't been the case in more recent history.
And Chief Curry's been pushing for that.
He's been pushing for that.
He's been really pushing for it. I mean, that's how I found out about it, to be fair, online.
He's been pushing for that hard. And again...
it's not a unified fight right now. It's a few groups are trying to establish sovereignty.
Well, I mean, it's not unified. It's not a unified
but even from what you're describing at the moment, I'm finding that there isn't that unification, because every part of the Maroons moving on has had a change come about from other people or different groups. So it's kind of, I hate the word saying it's, I don't like to say it, but it's like been washed out a little bit.
Well, to be fair, and it's in the same way that you see the community managers washed out. When I was in Kodjo Town, Trelawney Town in the 90s, there might have been 1,000 people, maybe just under 1,000 people there. I don't think any Maroon community in Jamaica has more than 1,000 people other than the compound. Okay. I mean, Moortown, again, in the 90s had about 1,500 people, 2,000 people. There's probably 300 people in Moortown now. I want to go to Alex Mayal, the Mayal priest, Alex Moore Minute, who's the Mayal priest, inherited one of the oldest. I mentioned earlier that he's inherited the oldest temple system in Jamaica. So Nani was the high priestess of the Mayal order, and Alex has inherited that temple, that 300-year-old temple complex. And the reason why I mention him is that there's still an Obia Act in Jamaica. So the Obia Act, and in the Obia Act, it mentions Maya. It doesn't mention Kumina, which kind of actually served as the origins of Rastafari. So Kumina comes from Congo.
So what's Kumina?
Kumina is a spiritual practice that primarily uses drums and dance, and it comes from the Congo.
So when you say spiritual practice, it's just a particular ritual, a particular thinking, or it's an entire belief system?
Kumina, academically they call it revivalism because it does still incorporate some aspects of Judaism.
So it's a mix.
Yeah, so I mean, to be fair, all of the spiritual traditions that you'll find in the Caribbean are admixture. And that's why I mentioned the Suriname Maroons, because they've been able to keep the Akan, ASAFO, Kung Fu, and they still call it Kung Fu.
Pretty much the same.
Yeah, Mayal comes out of the Arawak Taino and the ASAFO Chromanti spiritual traditions. So there's no one way to practice. And you'll even find within those traditions, it might be practiced a little bit differently across the island or across the diaspora. So Alex, I'm going to read this part as well. Mayal priest and former Kompong Minister of Foreign Affairs and Diplomacy, was initiated into and inherited one of the oldest spiritual orders in Jamaica, Mayalism, often considered a variation of Obia, and is distinctly Afro-Jamaican spiritual system, said to have been practiced by Queen Nanny, and its practice focused on the connection between nature, spirit and humans. Now, I think what also might be important here to mention around the Obia Act is that we used the water bodies on the island.
Remember, what is the Obia Act? You mentioned it a few times, but you haven't explained what it is.
So the Obia Act of, it would have been 1830 something. I forget the date that it was enacted. And to be fair, it's only enforced sporadically. So my friend Alex has experienced it when he's tried to kind of open up the Blue Lagoon, for example, for spiritual ceremony. And I think the Department for Leisure and Tourism said to you can't use it unless it's opening hours. And they used the Obia Act to enforce that specifically. So it's not, there's history of people being found with herbs or bottle of rum.
What is the Obia Act?
So it prohibits any use of spirituality outside of Christianity or any of the kind of Judaic system.
So this is a law.
It's a law against indigenous practices.
A law against indigenous, anything outside of the Abrahamic faith is illegal.
Yeah, so it's almost like a pagan act, if you like.
And it's illegal.
It's illegal. Yeah. So this is the part of the reason why Alex is fighting so strong at the moment for the opening of some of the water bodies like the Blue Lagoon, other areas like Petty Bottom River, places that we'd used for spiritual cleansing, purification. They'll kind of section it off and say you can't come here at certain times. And I guess from the Jamaican government's perspective, maybe they think it troubles tourism. I would argue the complete opposite, to be fair. It could then form a tourist attraction.
I learned about this Obia Act from you, but I wouldn't say it's to help tourism. I'd say black people, same in Africa, we're so Abrahamicified that we want to distance ourselves from these systems.
Practices.
So you would find the preacher or the pastor or whatever you want to call from each community calling out for something like that. No, shut that down, make that illegal. You know what I mean? And everyone's saying, cheering that on because nobody wants to be seen to be doing no judge. And
this is the thing. You know, at this point, I think it's important to mention this. So, the idea of juju. Eju is the twee terms for the indwelling spirit and the external universal spirit. So Eju is a spiritual practitioner that is trying to connect the individual spiritual sense with the external. So that's all the Juju man means. I mean, obviously, it's taken on connotations in the same way that
demonized.
It's
been demonized. Obviously, the whole thing has been demonized.
And I think it's important.
It's black is bad, bro. So.
Lastly, around modern day Maroons, I think what's happening in the Sahel at the moment with Burkina Faso, Niger and Mali linking up and making attempts to kind of kick the French out, I would say is the biggest, for me, on the continent at the moment, the biggest example of what I would call a modern day Maroon practices in terms of trying to.
I mean, I hear what you say, but they're not.
They don't self-identify as Maroons.
No, I mean they're not slaves. I just think that's revolution. That's just revolutionist. I know what you're saying about Maroons, but I would say Maroon community, from the definition that you gave me before, is people that were enslaved and freed themselves and then created a community.
It's a fight against colonialism.
Outside of the way I understood it, how you said it, it's like a community that have freed themselves. And created a community of freed people who freed ourselves.
Maroons are a distinct identity in terms of enslaved peoples that
have freed themselves in it and then created a community of us.
And the reason why I mention the Sahel state at the moment is because I think, in a political sense, away from Suriname, that is the best example we have of Maroon ideology in politics. So African leaders fighting against colonialism is, for me, an aspect of modern day Maroonage.
You said of the culture, of the way of thinking about things.
Yeah, the culture of resistance and rebellion.
So basically, the way you're saying it, that the whole of Africa needs to be Maroons, or have aspects of Maroon. Because that's what
I would definitely say
neo-colonialism
the whole
is how
of
it works
Africa
right
needs
now.
to adopt more Maroon approaches of resistance and rebellion to colonialism. 100%.
Because we're under neo-colonialism. Neo-colonialism.
100%.
You know what? Neo-colonialism. This is our entire subject we need to cover.
Yeah. No, we do it at some point.